Maybe, but will he live to regret having the black pieces? That's the big question. The games are beginning. 5 extra minutes for Magnus Carlsen could be decisive. He needs to win, however. Magnus with white plays the Spanish.
It's the Spanish on the board, and we're going to quickly jump into Toronto with Levy and James and their thoughts on the bids we saw and the opening that we're seeing right now.
Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, the opening, definitely a bit of a surprise. I mean, we have some sort of weird, we have an open Spanish, which I think is definitely in Fabiano's wheelhouse. I just want to say something. We were going to stand here as commentators and say, wow, Magnus bid 10. That was his max. He knew Fabi was going to bit 958. And then he said, I had no idea what's right.
It was funny, yeah.
Because, you know, I was going to be like, oh, that's such a brilliant read by Fabi. And then he just goes, yeah, I had no clue. They have so little time to make that decision.
That's true, bro. It's very quick. I mean, and of course, 958. Usually you see Magnus is the one that does it. Like, Magnus is the one that always outbids you by 1 or 2 seconds here. So Fabi may have a little mental edge here. You see how Magnus was pissed. Basically, you can just tell this is not the friendly Magnus right now. He's trying to close out.
And I do just want to say, this open Spanish, as we're about to throw it back there to Oslo for them to get into the X's and O's, this is an open Spanish. This is not a closed Spanish. Black has taken the pawn on e4. Lots of theory here. So Fabiano, despite the time disadvantage, is going to get to play a ton of moves that he already knows.
100%.
And then after that, it's just maybe 3 or 4 critical decisions.
Correct.
He might be in good shape.
I think it's a great choice as well. Open Spanish, you get a lot of moves in, as Norderbeck said before. When you're going to, you know, you need to get to like move 60s, you get that extra time and stuff like that. So this is going to be exciting, especially with having open Spanish. So.
Yeah, man, we might have two tiebreaker matches today. All right, Oslo, take it away.
Thanks, guys. James, you're right. No increment until move 60 for the players, where they get, after which they get a 1-second increment. Now, Fabi gets the result odds. The draw odds starts with 9 minutes, 58 seconds on the clock. And to me, that's a pretty good bargain.
Yeah, I think he's done everything right in the opening. Levy and James there kind of referred to it, the open Spanish. It's one of the most forcing lines as well in chess in general. Like, Fabiano, he gets black, gets draw odds, gets an opening he knows, in and out. Tension will be minimal here. It feels like everything's gone right for him. Still early stages, but I'm loving what Fabiano's done with the bid and with the opening.
Fabiano does have one unhappy memory, though, on the black side of an open Spanish, and that occurred in Madrid last year against Hikaru Nakamura. It was an open Spanish, a forcing line, a material imbalance. Fabiano lost that game, and with it, his chances at a world championship title. But we see in this game, he is solid in the center. That knight on e4 looks like it's under attack, but that just leads to a series of exchanges that black is not unhappy about. And after knight to d2, I've been wondering, can at some point black push the f pawn? That looks a little bit risky. Maybe instead he should put his bishop out on f5, and it resembles what Norderbeck and Wesley had in their match, this tension on the e4 square.
And to release that tension, you can trade pieces. And you can start with trading the knights and then put the bishop on f5, as you suggested, trying to get rid of as many minor pieces as possible. A draw would mean that Fabi wins the match. Magnus with white has to create his chances.
He has to, but how? He pauses now when the most obvious recapture would be by developing white's bishop. The white dark square bishop on c1 hasn't moved. Why not take back this black knight? But Magnus, he's looking for something creative, because at some point he'll need to surprise Fabiano. He'll need to switch it up, maybe hit him with a kind of shocking, unexpected move, and maybe he takes with the queen to try and bring the white queen closer to the king side. But either way, I still love black's position and black's chances in this game. The clock differential has now reduced to only 4 minutes.
And material might reduce. If he takes with the bishop on d2, just developing his undeveloped bishop, then black pushes the pawn in the center up to d4. And suddenly, it's not just things are blowing open, that the white king's in any danger, but pieces are leaving the board. And Fabiano still has so much time on his clock, 8 minutes, 34 seconds. A reminder to everybody that once they reach move 60, then there's 1 second added for each and every move you make. So this move, queen takes d2. I think it's trying to meet d4 with that queen escaping over to the king side, perhaps trying to initiate an attack.
Well, I've played these positions with black as well, and you're absolutely right. There are 2 ideas. Either black tries to trade off the light squared bishop with the move bishop f5. We see Fabi go for that. I think the problem with the immediate d4 is also you have to calculate what happens if the white rook slides onto the open d line. And that's why Magnus chose to vacate that square and capture with the queen. Bishop f5. To me, it looks like advantage Fabi out of the opening. He's already managed to swap off 2 pairs of minor pieces, and that's good news when you're looking for the draw.
Yeah, I simply don't see anything wrong with black's position. And Tanya, you made this, this exclamation because a queen trade in a must-win situation, it's counterintuitive, right?
That's what I would think, Robert. Queen f4, and I would grab that queen if a draw is what I needed for the match victory. But going into an endgame against Magnus Carlsen is always a scary thing.
And it's not just Magnus, it's the type of position that we have here. Because while Black's position does look healthy, a few things stand out to me. That pawn on c7, I see a diagonal opening up, and that pawn on c7 can be attacked if the pawn goes up to e6. And he just goes forward with d4. And look at Magnus. That c7 pawn really is a weakness. And look at the advantage bar. It's going up for white. Excuse me, the evaluation bar is showing an advantage for white. What does Fabiano have prepared once this c-file opens?
I think he's planning to move his knight. Unfortunately, you don't have time to come out with your bishop and skewer the white rooks because ultimately the white rook on e1 is defended by white's knight, so this would be a poor choice. White would be up 2 pieces for 1 black rook, and 2 pieces better than the rook in this case. Instead, I think he's banking on knight to b4, coming for this pawn, but also trying to head back into the middle of the board. What he might have underestimated or only now realized, Fabiano, is that after rook takes pawn, the knight dropping back, yes, this is a fork, yes, this is a double attack, but if the white rook just moves, suddenly black is stuck. This bishop is attacked, so knight takes bishop, rook takes would just be a trade, and white would emerge a pawn to the good. And if you move your bishop out the way to try and gain time against white's rook can save the day, swoop up and defend its bishop. Either way, Magnus is winning a pawn.
And he goes for it. And maybe this is the moment that you stop, and the idea you pointed out, threat is better than the execution, stronger than the execution. Do you just simply defend that bishop on e7 with the move that you're pointing out? And now I'm attacking your a2 pawn and knight d5, a big move on the board coming up.
It's a tough call, though, because there's a lack of clarity here. So many pieces remain. So if Fabiano spends some time right now and realizes that if I start with this knight d5 in the live position and trade off pieces, instead he does go for rook e8, I think it is a good call. But I say you have to assess, do I actually go down 1 pawn and that's okay because all rook endgames are drawn? It still would have been tough sledding ahead, but he decides to go rook e8, and now the a2 pawns threaten knight d3, knight d5, all sorts of knight jumps that white has to worry about.
I'm liking Black's position right now. There are all these threats on the board. I'm planning to equalize the material for Fabi. He hasn't burnt that much time on the clock, although I do see that Magnus is still ahead by 5 minutes. What do you think? How would you evaluate this position, David?
It's tough. I don't think we can make generalizations here. I think it's very concrete. If white isn't able to fend off one of these threats, or if white isn't able to save this pawn, then black is safe. Black is fine and will easily make the draw. So Magnus should spend as much time as possible here, as much time as is practical, and decide what to do next. The biggest threat of all is knight to d5. We should mention hitting the rook, hitting the bishop. So you need to move one of these 2 pieces, essentially. I think there's simply no other option. Knight to d5 is a winning threat, so he moves the bishop out the way. Maybe he could have gone in a different direction, but he's aiming to trade off and go for the f7 pawn. Magnus, I'm really surprised he didn't invest much more time there, because there were options available, but still testing Fabiano.
And I think he's going to continue testing him, because if we just go down one move, knight d3, it looks like it solves all of Black's problems. Hits the rook, hits the b2 pawn, and the e5 pawn all at once. Is there e6? Can you throw in that move, just causing chaos? Because if you take the rook on e1, that's not a free rook, because e takes f7 is check. I get the rook right back, and you see the evaluation is all the way at the top, because white is not just 1 pawn, and it will likely win a second at the very least. So this is something that maybe Magnus is going for. It's not just a trick. I think it is just objectively a good decision, and then the black king isn't feeling so safe.
Yeah, and if you take this pawn, suddenly there's real targets later in the game. And, OK, Fabiano dodges this. He plays f6. And big question for Magnus, do you drop back and maybe lose your winning chances, or do you go in and hope to muddy the waters? Magnus, sitting back in his chair, looks shocked.
He's reaching out, and he does go in. He's going for the aggressive approach. The rook on d8 is hanging. Is it time to start stepping up with that rook to target white's queenside pawns? How is Fabi going to react to this? And let's also point out, if Fabi loses this match, he is out of the finals.
He needs to get this game to get to a 3rd set like Wesley So was able to accomplish. And this is such a critical moment, because our first temptation, probably for everybody, is to save the rook, but go all the way up to d2, putting pressure on the pawns. But I'm realizing that once white pushes the pawn forward to e6, we have a protected passed pawn from the rook behind it, and that black rook can't actually take the pawn on b2. It's stuck to that d6 square, because if the knight, you push a pawn, then get your knight out, suddenly black is not able to deal with all the threats, and after e6, I don't really know what black does. I mean, this, as we're showing, is just going to be losing. I don't know how Fabi holds on here.
I think he just simply forgot that Magnus could keep the e-pawn alive. He wanted to trade it off at all costs, but he didn't have enough time, Fabiano. And suddenly, I mean, this pawn is just a monster. There's always tactics, actually, even on the back rank. And I don't even see a good move for black. You cannot move this knight. I mean, if you go in, for example, knight d6, I think your idea, Robert, still on the cards. If you remove this rook, remove the blockader, white's pawn will just motor through and promote. Ooh, Fabiano in big trouble suddenly, and 4 minutes on the clock. This turned in the space of 1 or 2 moves. He was on the brink of safety, but suddenly letting it slip. Magnus with the e-pawn. Big favourite.
And everything started so well, right? You start with this open Spanish, you quickly blitz out the moves, you're able to trade off the pieces really quickly, the pressure is dissolved. And then these last 2 moves, just inaccuracies by Fabi, big trouble, can't take the pawn on b2, can't put the knight in the way of the rook. The most important move to stop for Fabiano Caruana right now, do not allow Magnus to go knight to d6. That e-pawn will become a queen.
Yeah, but how do you stop that eventually happening? If you keep your black rook on the d-file, it means you're unable to go and grab pawns. Black's knight can never really re-centralize because then you block the d-file, allowing it to happen again.
OK, I have a question. What if Fabi just doesn't do anything, makes a move like a5? I'm waiting. How do you improve as white here?
I start pushing pawns to the king side, queen side.
Yeah, there are going to be some options there. At some point, if I get my king off the first, even rook d7 comes into mind. But what I'm looking at right now is black, I think, is 1 tempo short of knight c2 back to d4, going right after that e6 pawn, because David made an excellent point. There actually are back-rank checkmate ideas, just to show knight c2, rook to e4, and then knight to d4. And you go knight d6 here. It looks like you just blunder this pawn e6 with, let's say, even knight takes e6 or rook takes e6, just grabbing that pawn. But I can just take you on e6, and then I back rank checkmate you. So, of course, there are going to be moments where you can get away with something like this, but not here, not when your king doesn't have any escape squares.
Beautiful, beautiful tactics. And this type of thing, if not this exact variation, this type of thing will keep recurring. It's all about the black king being stuck right now. And at some point, I guess this knight just might be booted out. He gives his king some breathing space, so guarding against those motifs we mentioned, the black king now can at least mobilize. But how does Magnus continue? That is the big question. Is there a way forward? Can he eventually brute force it and push this pawn to glory? Still some work to be done for the world number 1.
A much better waiting move, a kind of a waiting move by Fabi, the move h5, like you said, just giving a lift to black's king. And now ideas of knight c2 or knight d3 are in the air. Magnus putting pressure on the clock, reaching out to make his next move. Fabi does hit the under 3-minute mark. Still far away, far, far away from meeting move 60, getting that additional second. So it's not only keeping it on the board, but Fabi also has to avoid getting flagged.
2 minutes and 55 seconds in this position. You have to reach move 60 just to get that bonus time with every move made. And this is such a tricky moment for Fabiano Caruana, but Magnus is doing the right thing, investing some time here, because perhaps he could put the game away not caring about the clock. Even if you gave Fabiano a day, you see the evaluation bar is all the way up here. I'm already looking at ways to go after the h5 pawn. If I can land a rook on h8, my coach always taught me about dream moves. That would be checkmate. So rook back to c5 at some moment. That looks very enterprising to me, trying to go for the black king.
Yeah, I love it, Robert. Or pick up the white rook on e1, somehow plonk it on h8, rook e4, rook h4, take the pawn. Yeah, all these ideas popping through Magnus Carlsen's mind right now. He must sense that he's doing well, and I think the moment it became tactical, he banks on his chances, both on the board and on the clock. But still, he wants the accuracy. These top players are perfectionists. They don't want to let any opportunities slip. And OK, he's pausing what to do first. Does he push a pawn, kick away the black knight? Does he lift the white rook up the board? Does he, I don't know, push white's kingside pawns forward? There's so many options for Magnus Carlsen. Critical moment. He's in the tank now, 2 minutes. Once he starts playing, I'm expecting a quick flurry of moves.
It's where players often go wrong, though. When there's too many choices, you think this one looks just as good as the other, but there could be a flaw, and you could give black just the necessary time to get back in the game. And black does have some threats. A knight coming into d3 that hits the rook on e1, hits multiple pawns. And for Magnus, he paused, and he does bring his rook up to e4. So any knight jump here doesn't come with an attack against that rook. And rook h4, rook takes h5, rook h8, checkmate, not out of the question.
Yeah, far from out of the question. And first of all, posing a difficult question to black's knight. 3 possible squares. I think you simply have to move that knight. Perhaps you can defend it with black's pawn, but there's downsides, there's pros and cons to every single knight jump. And Fabiano is basically a 1 in 3, 1 in 4. I even forgot that this was possible. But it's so far offside now, that black knight. It's not coming back into action anytime soon. Magnus, therefore, has the luxury of a few turns to really close in, either push the pawn or go for that black king, as we've mentioned.
Fabi levels the material for now, but in that deal, he does put his knight completely offside. Does this give Magnus enough time to try and go for the checkmating idea that you pointed out, sliding the rook to the h-line? The one defensive resource that Fabi has is to push that g-pawn to g6 to make sure that the h-file remains blocked, and at least for the time being, rook h8 will not be checkmate.
Fabi definitely does not want to open up the 7th rank, but it may be a sad necessity just to avoid that immediate demise. So g6 at any moment for black does defend that pawn that's sticking out there, but that 7th rank being open is very dangerous. So I'm looking at this for Magnus. Everything does look good, but if you go rook h4, pawn g6, I actually don't see how to end the game, and that's good news for Fabiano. He may believe he's got a fighting chance.
Under 2.5 minutes right now. He doesn't only have to fight the board. Again, he has to fight the clock as well. It is, what is that? It's 35 moves to make it to move 60, and that's a far way off with complications still on the board. The e-pawn 2 steps away from queening. So there are checkmating ideas on the king side. You have to avoid white's knight jumping onto d6, the pawn promoting further to e7. There's a lot to fight for in this position. How is Fabi going to manage this?
It's not going to be easy. I think Fabiano's moves will be influenced by Magnus's moves. Right now, the black knight simply fixed on a2, no retreat squares. Black's rook stuck defending the d6 square. And actually, I'm looking for Magnus just manifesting, just imagining perfect pawns, perfect pieces. If white could land a pawn on f5, protect his advanced e-pawn, he's simply winning. So maybe push the pawn to f4. He actually defends that pawn with his rook, and the eval bar slides slightly down. This idea, I think, is a dual-purpose threat. Firstly, attacking black's a6 pawn, and secondly, creating that d6 square for the white knight to hop back to.
And it frees up the e4 rook as well to go on over to h4. But Fabi, he backtracks with his own rook, and the a6 pawn can be captured. So white will be a pawn ahead. But then that black knight, it survives. It goes up to c1, and then maybe back around to d3. If Fabi could pick up that knight and place it on e5 to trade off a pair of knights, he will have better chances, but his knight's been offside. It's not a good piece, and Magnus, he maintains this momentum, and I just feel like for Fabi, every single move is so challenging.
And to make it a good piece, Fabi thinks it's worth giving up a pawn. Is Magnus going to allow Fabi's knight back into play? He is reaching out, I think, for the rook to capture that a6 pawn, but hesitates, pulls back.
Magnus does not look happy, though. He does not look so convinced that it's totally winning. We see the eval bar, but I think it's deceptive. As white, you know the stakes are high. If a set of rooks disappear, if the knights ever disappear, drawing chances only increase. So you need to still continue being energetic and accurate to maintain this advantage. He tries to trade off the rooks now because that would allow the white knight to come back to more active squares. The white knight ultimately is the one that will remove the blockader of the e-pawn. I think this was a key move from Magnus Carlsen.
And that white knight will not only jump to d6, but if black rook moves forward to e7, it will attack it further from that f5 square, eventually getting that e6 pawn rolling down the board. Fabi cannot afford to let that happen. Sidesteps with the rook, and the rook is back on the 7th rank. Knight d6, once again a threat on the board.
That's the killer blow for Fabiano, the death knell, because he wants to bring his knight back into b3. He does just that. But once you get knight d6 in here, the only thing that Magnus needs to be careful about is if that black knight gets to c5, that forks both of his rooks. So rook c1 check, followed by knight c5 at some moment. Unfortunately, after knight d6, his rook on e8's under attack, so I don't think he's going to survive this one.
Ooh, watch out. There's a threat of a draw right now. Perpetual check. Black's knight, if it comes down to f1, checks the white king, and the white king cannot escape.
And Magnus, with a head shake, he was not expecting to move knight to d2. He thought he had it in the bag when he played knight d6. And Fabi throws a curveball with this one. Big threat.
He's lucky he's still winning, Magnus Carlsen, after missing this nasty, sneaky move. The white rook is attacked, but you cannot move it. If you move the white rook, or if you capture the black rook, draw on the spot. The black knight comes to f1, check, forces the white king back, and we'll see a yo-yo. The black knight move, discover check, and this dance will last forever. Magnus needs to give some space to his king.
It's the type of move that completely rattles a player. You can see Magnus, he needs to regroup right now. And just like yesterday when he's the one who sacrificed his queen, Fabiano finding a desperate try, but he pushes a pawn, does Magnus Carlsen. He trades off a pair of rooks. G7 is now loose. So Magnus, despite the initial shock, he still found the best continuation.
And that's where having time on the clock is such a lifesaver. Here, Fabiano simply doesn't have enough time. Down to just over 1 minute. We're only at move 33. Increment a distant dream. It's going to be a race on the clock, even if he weren't losing this position. But it does, unfortunately, look like that white e-pawn is going to decide matters. White's king now given enough air to survive on its own. It will take care of itself. The other white pieces will get the job done. And, OK, he's sliding behind. Good try from Fabiano, trying to put his rook behind a pass pawn. That's what we're taught in all positions. But it's just collapsing. The g-pawn is now up for grabs.
But don't take it with the rook, because if you take that pawn with the rook, the king steps to the side, hitting the knight on the 8. The knight can't move because it's the only piece defending that rook over there. So Magnus still has his work cut out for him. Fabiano's creating a challenge, but now that pawn is 1 square away from promotion, and I think it's going to get to the other side.
And Magnus Carlsen taking his time. This could very well be Fabiano Caruana's very last moments in the Champions Chess-Off final. And you can see it in him. And Magnus knows he's close to victory in this one. Fabi pushes the f-pawn. Is there a knight jump? Knight moving to c7. Do you have the path right now to get that e-pawn to e8?
Perhaps, although the black knight goes back to f6 and holds things for now. That's why Fabiano has vacated the f6 square with his pawn thrust, but it is desperation. Magnus doesn't need to break kind of this formation. Actually, black is stuck. Black can barely move anything at all. The white knight jumping out the way, you can play that at will later on. Maybe he'll play it now. Maybe he'll move the knight. You can even take the g7 pawn if you want to be really flashy with the white knight. But I'm expecting Magnus to just take a calm approach, not allow any counterplay or any tricks at all.
Fabiano's down to 42 seconds, and this may be the last 42 seconds of his entire event here. If he loses, he's eliminated. Look at that move, g5, taking away that knight's backtrack.
Beautiful move from Magnus Carlsen there, just removing any defensive hope at all.
Yeah.
Look at Fabiano in pain. Oh, he's got no time, simply. Under 30 seconds now.
Oh, and I think he's just coming to terms with everything that's happening, because it is not just about losing this game. Fabiano Caruana will be eliminated. He will be knocked out of the Champions Chess-Off finals. He takes a break. He does pick up the pawn, but now that knight will not jump back to f6 to guard that e-pawn from promoting. There's a check on f3, but I think it's only a check. And Magnus needs to pause, calculate. He does it. He realizes that knight f3 is just a check, grabs that g7 pawn, and it's handshakes. Fabiano Caruana is eliminated. Magnus Carlsen stamps his ticket to the finals.
And what a great game there from Magnus. He even missed a tactic. He was shaken, but he was able to regain his composure. He eliminates Fabiano Caruana, but congratulations are in order to Magnus Carlsen.